In this video, we're going to get started with some of the basic transaction assumptions that we need for our leveraged buyout model. Now you see on your screen right now that I have created here a basic outline for some of the key assumptions that we'll have to make here. And really much of this is actually very similar to what we saw in our merger model. So if you go back to our merger model, we had a per share purchase price. In this case for RIM, this was a scenario where Apple was buying Research in Motion. And then we figured out what the equity purchase price was. So we went in and calculated diluted shares outstanding at the offer price, and we used that to get to the purchase price of the company. And then we figured out how much cash, debt, and stock Apple was going to use to buy Research in Motion. Then we had these other assumptions on the debt interest rate, the foregone interest on cash, and the new shares issued, and then on synergies. So many of these assumptions are going to be similar in our leveraged buyout model because, once again, we have a company being purchased here. In this case, though, we have a private equity firm buying the company, so some of the assumptions here will be a bit different from what we saw in the merger model. So to start with the leveraged buyout model here, instead of just assigning a random share price to Apple, what we're going to do instead is assign an offer premium to their current share price. So whenever you buy a public company, you cannot just go in and pay $200 per share if they're trading at $200 per share currently. The shareholders are going to want more than that. So you're going to have to come in and offer some type of premium to their current share price. In this case, for the offer premium, I'm going to say 20%, which is about standard. Usually for most large public M&A deals like this, you see between a 10 and 30% premium on M&A deals. So this is right about in the middle of the range. Now, if we want to be more precise here, we could go back to our valuation work for Apple, and we could say, okay, well, according to the DCF and the other analyses here, their share price should be around $200 a share, somewhere in that range. And then based on that, we could then come up with the appropriate premium here. But in this case, just for illustrative purposes, and because for a deal like this, usually you would need more than a 5% premium to get it done, I'm going to say a 20% offer premium. So for the offer price per share, all we do is take our current share price and multiply by 1 plus the offer premium. We see now, I've already filled in all the purchase price calculations here. This is exactly the same as what we saw in Apple's three-statement model over here. So we have our basic shares, we have our diluted shares, and we have dilution from options right here. The only difference is that with our basic LBO model, rather than working off the current share price, we're working off of the offer price per share. So we see the purchase price here will be around $212 billion with an enterprise value of around $177 billion. There is definitely more dilution from these shares now because the exercise price has remained the same, but the offer price has gone up from 192 to 230 right here. Now the next assumption we want to make is how much debt we're going to be using to finance this purchase. Now in the merger model, we had three different possibilities: cash, debt, or stock. But with the leveraged buyout model, we cannot use stock because this private equity firm is not a public company, and even if they were a public company, market cap wise, they're going to be much smaller than Apple. So using stock is not a real possibility here. Private equity firms can only use cash and debt to buy a company like this. So we're going to limit ourselves to debt and equity here. Equity, by the way, is just another name for cash. I know there's a lot of confusion here because you have shareholders' equity, equity value, percent equity here, and so there are many different ways you can use this. But in the context of a leveraged buyout model, percent equity just means how much cash the PE firm is putting forward for the company. So going back to our house analogy, the debt here would be the mortgage and the equity would be the down payment. So for the percentages here, I'm going to say 50% for debt. And then for the equity, we want this to be flexible so that later on, if we make sensitivity tables, for example, or we do other types of analysis, we can look at many different scenarios. So instead of hard coding in a 50 here, I'm going to say equals 1 minus the debt percentage. And so this way, if we change our debt to 40%, the equity changes to 60%. And so our model is truly flexible like that. So we have a purchase being financed 50% with debt, 50% with equity. Again, this is about typical. Now, if the market gets very frothy, often the debt percentage can go much higher than this, but most of the time in recent years, PE firms have only been able to finance around 50% of the purchase price with debt, and often it's much less than that. Often this is more like 20%, 30%, somewhere in that range. So with these assumptions, now let's go over here and start filling out some of the relevant information on the right side of our assumptions. So first, for the equity purchase price, we're just going to link directly to the diluted equity value right here. We're assuming that we're acquiring all the shares and that dilution is in effect, so we have to acquire the shares created from dilution as well. For the enterprise value, we're going to link directly to our enterprise value down here. Now for the EBITDA purchase multiple, this one's extremely important because whenever a PE firm is buying a company, everything is based off of EBITDA. So the amount of debt they can take on, the amount that they're paying for the company, the amount that they can sell the company for, everything with leveraged buyout models is based on EBITDA and EBITDA multiples. So to calculate this one, we're going to take our enterprise value up here and go back to our three-statement model and find Apple's EBITDA for 2009. We're assuming that this transaction takes place at the very end of 2009. So we have around a 13.4x multiple. This is relatively high for a leveraged buyout. Often with these types of deals, you see a multiple between 5 and 10 times, but we are dealing with Apple here. They're already trading at a pretty high level, and they're definitely one of the most hyped companies. So it's not unusual that we would see an EBITDA multiple in this range for this type of transaction. Now for the debt required, we're just going to take our 50% here and multiply by the equity purchase price. Same for equity, we're going to take our equity percentage and multiply by the equity purchase price. So you have 106 billion of debt and 106 billion of equity. Now the other thing we need to decide on here is what our EBITDA exit multiple is going to be. Remember that in the analogy we used before, we said that if you go and buy a house for 500,000 and then you sell it at the end for 600,000, hopefully you're making some kind of good return on your investment because you're selling it for more than you bought it for. But with a leveraged buyout model, we want to be more precise than this, and instead of just making up numbers like this, we want to base it on a multiple of EBITDA or free cash flow or some other kind of valuation metric like that. In this case, EBITDA is the most important metric for a company like Apple, so we're going to base our exit price, the sale price for the company, on a multiple of EBITDA here. Now usually to determine this one, you look at the public company comparables and see what they're trading at. So in this case, we see median multiples in the 5, 7, 8x range. So we could take that into account in our analysis. Often what we do here also is we look at the EBITDA purchase multiple and then we pick a slightly reduced number for the EBITDA exit multiple because we assume that over time valuations come down, multiples come down. So I'm going to say 10x here for the EBITDA exit multiple. And again, keep in mind that this is not strictly one number. We will be looking at a sensitivity analysis around this and looking at a range of values. This is just our baseline assumption for the model. Now, these two remaining items here, advisory fee percentage and financing fee percentage, this is something that we overlooked in our merger model before because this was not part of our assumptions at all. But whenever you have a deal like this, you have lots of other parties who are going to need to be compensated. So with advisory fees, you probably have investment bankers advising on this deal. They're going to need to take some kind of fee from it. You have lawyers, you have accountants, you have all sorts of other advisors who are contributing with legal work, accounting work, due diligence work, and so they're going to need to be compensated. With the financing fee angle, for this one, you have debt being used in this transaction, and to raise this debt, you're going to have to pay investment bankers to go out and look for investors, to go out and find parties to actually buy this debt to finance this transaction. So you're going to have to pay a financing fee for the debt. Usually the advisory fee is much less than the financing fee, and it's usually based on a percentage of the deal value, so in this case the equity purchase price. For the advisory fee, I'm going to say 0.02%. For the financing fee, I'm going to say 0.06%. These may seem very small, but keep in mind that we're working with extremely large numbers. So 0.2%, for example, of the 212 billion here comes out to around $43 million. So bankers are going to make $43 million or somewhere in that range off of this deal. And And so we're going to need to be taking these numbers into account and these fees into account when we go in and create some of our schedules showing where the funds are coming from and where the funds are going to purchase Apple in this case. So those are some of the basic assumptions that we need to get started with our basic leverage buyout model right here. One final point I want to mention is that in this example, this type of leverage buyout for over $200 billion is completely implausible. No leverage buyout has ever been that large, and especially given the time frame we're looking at here, 2009, 2010, there's just no way the market would have supported this. So this is purely hypothetical. A leverage buyout this large has never taken place and probably will never take place in the near future. But we are just doing this for illustrative purposes, and so you learn how an LBO model works. But in reality, a company as large as Apple cannot really be purchased by private equity firms. It's simply too big. Usually the limit on LBOs is around 40, 50 billion, somewhere in that range. So Apple is many times too large to actually be acquired by a private equity firm. Coming up in the next video, we're going to be getting started with some of our other assumptions that we need, specifically looking at debt, and then going into some of our operating assumptions, sources and uses, and then creating our model from the ground up.